Hi everybody, thank you for joining me again as I continue to examine Frank Turek and Norman Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, from an atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover Chapter 6, which is subtitled New Life Forms, From the Goo to You via the Zoo. It's a serious book. The chapter begins with a summary of the film Contact, which of course was based on the novel written by Carl Sagan. Geisler and Turek tell us how the scientist, the protagonist of Contact, played by Jodie Foster, knew that she had received an intelligent extraterrestrial signal by the fact that it contained a long series of prime numbers. If a simple series of prime numbers in a radio signal indicates intelligence, Geisler and Turek reason, then how is it that the much more complicated information found in living cells doesn't indicate an intelligent origin? And they go on to quote Sagan from Cosmos, describing the human brain as containing the equivalent of 20 million books of information, a far more complex machine than anything humans have ever been able to produce, or indeed anything else that we have ever discovered. Then Geisler and Turek ask the question, quote, if intelligent human beings can't create anything close to the human brain, why should we expect non-intelligent natural laws to do so? And actually there are lots of really excellent reasons for expecting that, which we'll get into as we go through the book. But first, let's get into the chapter. The first section is subtitled, What About New Life Forms? So where do new life forms come from? And can natural selection really account for the diversity of life that we observe on Earth? Geisler and Turek take a moment before addressing these questions to ridicule scientific attempts to explain the origin of life. As they did in the previous chapter, they repeat their assertion from Chapter 5 that all the evidence points to an intelligent designer, and that scientists who reject God's involvement resort to just so stories that magically give them that first life form arising from non-living chemicals. Overlooking the fact, I would like to point out that their explanation is literally a magical one. They say, quote, the Darwinists' position is even more problematic when you consider that they don't even have an explanation for the source of the non-living chemicals. And this is an especially silly thing for Geisler and Turek to say, considering how much better the naturalistic explanation for the origin of chemicals is than their God did it hypothesis. We know that elementary particles emerged from the Big Bang, and hydrogen and helium, the lightest elements, formed soon after that, and we know that every element heavier than boron, that's everything from carbon all the way through the rest of the periodic table, was formed by nucleosynthesis either in the cores of stars or during supernovae when stars explode. We have very, very good empirical scientific reasons for thinking this. And if Geisler and Turek think that's not where the chemical elements, including those that make life possible, come from, then I would be very interested to hear their proposal. I would love to hear their evidence as to why the nucleosynthesis, the stellar nucleosynthesis theory is wrong, and what happens instead. I've never heard that. If the chemical elements weren't produced by those processes that I just described, but by God, what did God do? See, this is a problem with the God hypothesis in general. It's always incredibly vague. What did God do? Specifically, how did God do it? When did God do it? How can we tell that God did it? How can we differentiate something that God did from something that God didn't do? These are questions that are very important, that intelligent design, creationism, whatever you wish to call it, it's all the same thing, don't even address most of the time. And I would expect that if Geisler and Turek want me to accept these premises of theirs, that they would demonstrate the validity of their explanation with lots and lots of good solid evidence. After all, as they themselves say on the very same page of this chapter, as I took that previous quote from, quote, suggesting a possibility is not enough. They have to present evidence if they are going to be scientific. I could not have said that any better. Geisler and Turek now examine the difference between microevolution and macroevolution. First, Geisler and Turek challenge the term natural selection. Since no intelligence is supposedly involved, they say, no selection has taken place. The fittest creatures survive. That is natural selection in a nutshell. This doesn't strike Geisler and Turek as a meaningful observation. Geisler and Turek acknowledge the occurrence of microevolution, which has become boilerplate for modern creationism. For example, the survival of resistant bacteria following a dose of antibiotics. But they deny the occurrence of macroevolution, since, as they say, bacteria will always stay bacteria. Geisler and Turek claim that scientists make no distinction between microevolution and macroevolution, and they accuse them of dishonesty for this. But this isn't true. It is true that microevolution and macroevolution are considered to be the same process. But there is a distinction, and that distinction is one of time. Macroevolution is microevolution operating on a geological timescale. Quote, natural selection has never been observed to create new types. And there are a few things wrong with this quote. First, as Geisler and Turek have already said themselves, natural selection doesn't actually create anything. It's the name we give to the phenomenon of the fittest organisms surviving to perpetuate their genes through their offspring. New species really begin ultimately with the occurrence of mutations, and it is simply natural selection that decides which mutations will be allowed to endure. Second, new species have absolutely been observed. That's simply not true. Typically, speciation does take place over a period much longer than a human lifetime, and we shouldn't really expect to be able to observe those types of changes at that level. But there are exceptions to that rule, and to cite one example, there are new plant species that have been observed emerging very quickly within a single generation as a result of polyploidy, which is when an organism is born with more than two sets of chromosomes as a result of a mutation or an error in cell division and mitosis. There are various causes of it, but that is an example of a new species suddenly appearing completely naturally. But why, according to Geisler and Turek, can't natural selection result in macroevolution? Let's just go with them on this. Well, they give us 5 reasons as to why macroevolution cannot result in new species. The first reason is what they call genetic limits. What do they mean by genetic limits? Well, they mean the barrier that prevents one species from becoming another. And they use the example of dog breeding. Dogs might come out all different shapes and sizes as a result of selective breeding, but they're always dogs, no matter how the breeders have manipulated them. I challenge this example. The fact that dog breeding only ever produces dogs doesn't strike me as a very strong point against natural selection, since the goal of dog breeding is to produce dogs. I should also point out that only creationists believe that these so-called genetic limits exist. Biologists don't. There is no scientifically identified mechanism that keeps genetic changes resulting in microevolutionary changes from tipping over into something that we would consider a macroevolutionary change. It's all the accumulation of changes and the accumulation of attributes. And if you think about it that way, the idea of such a limit is absolute nonsense. Geisler and Turek admit that changes can accumulate as a result of microevolution, but when those changes accumulate to the point of speciation, they just magically stop. And if they don't just magically stop, if there is some limitation that prevents speciation and changes on even larger scales, then what is that limitation? Where is it? What is its nature? Where can we find it? What is it doing? What is happening to make this kind of macroevolution impossible? Number 2 is cyclical change. This is the idea that the changes produced by evolution shift back and forth within a limited range, but they don't result in the kind of major changes that we would account for with macroevolution. Geisler and Turek use the example of Darwin's finches, whose beaks changed sizes to adapt to the weather. They say, quote, "Notice that no new life forms came into existence. They always remained finches. Only the relative proportion of existing large-beaked to small-beaked finches changed. Notice also that natural selection cannot explain how finches came into existence in the first place. Well, cyclical change can occur. It's not the only kind of change that can occur. Geisler and Turek miss that point. But it can occur. There's nothing in the theory of evolution to tell us not to expect to see cyclical change. As Geisler and Turek themselves said earlier in this chapter, natural selection means that the fittest species survive. And fitness is a relative thing. Attributes that make a species fit for one environment might not make it fit for a different environment. And if a species lives in an environment that is cyclical, where conditions regularly change, these sorts of cyclical changes in the evolution of animals that live in that environment are just what we would expect to see. But cyclical change is not the only kind of evolutionary change. And I find it incredibly dishonest to continue to cite examples where microevolution has been observed but has not resulted in new species when evolutionary theory doesn't predict change on that scale in such a short time to begin with. As I said earlier, there are some relatively rare circumstances, like polyploidy, where speciation can occur very quickly. But for the most part, evolution works very, very slowly. The fact that Darwin's finches didn't magically transform themselves into macaws in the summer and penguins in the winter, which is apparently what Geisler and Turek seem to expect, proves nothing, because evolutionary theory doesn't tell us to expect those sorts of abrupt major changes. And again, Geisler and Turek are confusing evolution with abiogenesis when they point out that natural selection can't account for where the finches came from in the first place. No, natural selection doesn't explain that, but it doesn't mean to. Reason number 3 is a golden oldie: irreducible complexity. Geisler and Turek define what they mean by irreducible complexity by quoting one of the men most responsible for propagating that idea among intelligent design advocates and creationists, Michael Behe. Quote, "An irreducibly complex system is," quoting Behe now, "composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning." And Geisler and Turek go on, quote, "Behe's research verifies that living things are literally filled with molecular machines that perform the numerous functions of life. These molecular machines are irreducibly complex, meaning that all the parts of each machine must be completely formed in the right places, in the right sizes, in operating order at the same time for the machine to function." A worldwide consensus of biologists begs to differ with Michael Behe, both on the existence of irreducibly complex systems and also on how complex systems got there. Behe, of course, is a major voice in the intelligent design movement. He sees no naturalistic way of accounting for what he calls irreducibly complex systems. But despite the protestations of Behe and Geisler and Turek, there are ways, established, demonstrated ways, for complex systems to evolve naturally. One of the most well-known examples of this is the Krebs Cycle, which is a complicated series of chemical reactions that plays a key role in cellular metabolism, which if you took a college-level biology course or even high school biology, you probably learned about at some point, even if, like me, you really can't remember anything about it. But the Krebs cycle plays a key role in cellular metabolism, and the evolution of the Krebs cycle was explained persuasively, naturalistically, in a paper that, appropriately enough, was published the same year as Behe's best-selling book, Darwin's Black Box. And that's just one example. There are numerous, incredibly complex biological systems that would surely qualify as irreducibly complex under Behe's definition, that we can explain through a natural evolutionary explanation. Number 4, non-viability of transitional forms. Geisler and Turek claim that transitional forms in evolutionary history of species could not survive. They say, quote, "For example, consider the Darwinian assertion that birds evolved gradually from reptiles over long periods of time. This would necessitate a transition from scales to feathers. How could a creature survive that no longer has scales but does not quite have feathers? First, birds and reptiles are not species. Those are classes, according to modern taxonomy. Species is a few levels below class at the bottom of the taxonomic hierarchy. There are thousands and thousands of species that belong to the classes of birds, aves, and reptiles, reptilia. This is something creationists often do, either due to ignorance or to just willful dishonesty on their part. They use terms like type without defining what a type is. Is a type a species? Is a type a genus, a family, an order, a class? What is a type? Second, Geisler and Turek again exhibit a very poor understanding of how evolution works. The line separating a species from its immediate evolutionary ancestor is a lot blurrier than they are implying, and indeed the line separating a class like birds that evolved from another class like reptiles is even more broad and blurry. There's not a hard black line. It's like, okay, here's where reptiles became birds. That's just not the way it works, especially at that level of class. Finally, the example of birds evolving from reptiles is a particularly bad one for Geisler and Turek's purposes, since we know that there were dinosaur species that had feathers. Geisler and Turek make the argument from Irreducible Complexity when they talk about the transition from reptile to bird. They say things like they would have had to transition from scales to feathers, and what good would it have done for a creature to have no scales and half feathers? They wouldn't have been able to fly. What possible advantage could that have had? But there are other advantages possible from feathers besides flight, and anything that results in an advantage can be favored by natural selection. We might today associate feathers with birds and flying, but that doesn't mean that a feather on a non-flying creature doesn't give it any possible evolutionary benefit. Anything that results in an advantage can be favored by natural selection. Anything that it could possibly provide it with better camouflage, better protection from the elements, could make it look more attractive to the opposite sex and make it easier to mate and pass on its genetic material. There are all sorts of possible benefits to having feathers, even a few proto-feathers, if that's even a word, short of being able to actually fly. And then 5, molecular isolation. Geisler and Turek challenge the idea of common descent. They say, quote, Darwinists think the DNA similarity between apes and humans, for example, strongly implies an ancestral relationship. But is this evidence for common ancestry or for a common creator? It could be interpreted either way. It could, if you don't give a shit about evidence. Geisler and Turek argue that the fact that all life on Earth shares a common genetic code could just as easily be evidence that life was produced by the same creator who designed all the various life forms to live in the same biosphere. And sure, it could be, hypothetically, if we're just tossing out ideas, but do we have any good reasons for thinking it is evidence for a creator rather than for common descent? Which is more likely to be the case given the evidence that we have? That life evolved from common ancestors via the demonstrated and well understood natural mechanisms of evolution, or that life was created by an undemonstrated, unsubstantiated, largely undefined intelligent designer? Show me the evidence that this designer exists, and evidence of what specifically this designer did and how we can recognize it, and then we can talk. Next, they claim that the fossil record is actually evidence for what they call supernatural creation. They actually use the term supernatural creation rather than for evolution. And they quote mine Stephen Jay Gould to establish that there are gaps in the fossil record and that species in the fossil record don't exhibit change and seem to appear suddenly and fully formed. Quote, but instead of adopting creationism, Gould rejected the gradualism of Darwinism and formulated a theory he called punctuated equilibria. Gould had no natural mechanism by which this could have occurred, but since he was an atheist, he had to explain the fossil record somehow. This is a classic case of allowing your prejudices to taint your observations. Can these guys get through a single page without projecting? Geisler and Turek also make the same mistake here that William Lane Craig did in Reasonable Faith when he talked about Gould's punctuated equilibrium theory, talking about it as though it is somehow a denial of Darwinian evolution, and it's not at all. Also, I'm glad to see that they are admitting that intelligent design and creationism are the same thing, because I know that hasn't always been easy for you guys. Geisler and Turek make a really big deal about this idea of species just appearing fully formed and at the same time in the fossil record. And they call this evidence of instantaneous creation, when fully formed species just suddenly appear in the fossil record. And they forget, or they just don't know, that what appears instantaneous to us when we examine the fossil record actually took place over long periods of time. They reference the Cambrian explosion, but they don't mention that it occurred over tens of millions of years, which is plenty of time for evolution to do some pretty impressive things. And like their Mount Rushmore analogy in the previous chapter, where they proposed allowing natural geological forces to act on a mountain for 10 years, and then coming back to check to see if Mount Rushmore had been created by those natural forces, Geisler and Turek apparently just have no understanding of the timescales involved in evolution. It takes longer than 10 years. It takes longer than a couple hundred years, or even a couple thousand years in most cases. It takes a long time. And a few feet in the fossil record, a few feet separating one strata of rock from another, can represent millions and millions of years. Geisler and Turek also seemingly expect to see a smooth, unbroken series of transitions in the fossil record if evolution were true. And this isn't realistic for a number of reasons. First, fossils are hard to make. There are many species that we know must have existed for which we have no fossil record at all. Fossilization requires very particular circumstances, and there's no guarantee that specimens of every species will be preserved as fossils for us to find, although that would be really nice. Second, evolutionary change doesn't occur at a constant rate. If a species is well adapted to its environment and the environment doesn't change and the species doesn't move somewhere else, it may remain relatively unchanged for as long as those conditions to which it has adapted endure. If those conditions change suddenly, then an evolutionary transition could also occur suddenly. And again, suddenly is on a geological timescale, not suddenly as we would use the word in everyday speech. And there are also other explanations for a species suddenly appearing in a fossil record. For instance, a species migrating to that location from a previous location. Moving on, quote, "Since we all have to live in the same biosphere, we should expect some creatures to have similar designs. To posit Darwinism, you must be able to explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. You must explain how the palm tree, the peacock, the octopus, the locust, the bat, the hippopotamus, the porcupine, the seahorse, the Venus flytrap, the human, and mildew, for example, have all descended from the first irreducibly complex life without intelligent intervention. The theory of evolution does explain that astounding diversity of life. That is its purpose." What I find most interesting about this quote is that Geisler and Turek are claiming that both the similarities shared by organisms and the differences between them are evidence for their intelligent designer. Both of these things are actually well explained by evolution. The similarities are due to our common ancestry, and the differences are what results from organisms adapting to their various environments. Geisler and Turek assert that both the similarities and the differences among organisms are evidence for intelligent design, but they don't say how. Again, unless they can define who or what their designer is, what their designer did, and how we know, their arguments are meaningless. Their theory is useless. It explains nothing. They might as well be arguing that Paul Bunyan dug the Grand Canyon. Next section is intelligent design and intelligent alternative. It's a real short answer to that, but I'm just going to go through the book. Geisler and Turek say they agree with Darwinists that evolution is a fact, if we're talking about microevolution, not macroevolution. There is no natural explanation for the origin of new life forms, they say. Intelligent design is the best explanation, but Darwinists are always attacking it in order to defend their own untenable position. Some more of that projection we've been seeing. Geisler and Turek present 4 objections to intelligent design from evolutionary biologists, from evolutionists as they call them, and their responses. First objection: intelligent design is not science. If intelligent design is not science, Geisler and Turek say, then neither is Darwinism, since both fields are attempting to discover what happened in the past. If intelligent design is ruled out, they say, then Darwinism itself must be ruled out, along with archaeology, cryptology, and forensic criminal investigations, among many other sciences that seek to discover what happened in the past. They're answering the wrong objection here, I think. When people say that intelligent design isn't science, they aren't claiming that it's illegitimate because it's attempting to discover what happened in the past. They're saying it's illegitimate because it violates the scientific method. ID advocates like Geisler and Turek begin with the assumption that God, their God, the God of the Bible as they interpret it, is real and plays an active role in reality, causing events to occur. They start with that. They don't base that on evidence. They begin their intelligent design argument with that assumption already in place. So they've reached their conclusion before they've even begun their investigation. The scientific method is supposed to end with the conclusion, not begin with it. So ID isn't disqualified as a science because of what it does, but because of how it does it. Next objection: intelligent design commits the God of the gaps fallacy. Geisler and Turek dispute that they are using a gap argument because, quote, first, when we conclude that intelligence created the first cell, or the human brain, it is not simply because we lack evidence of a natural explanation. It's also because we have positive, empirically detectable evidence for an intelligent cause. A message, specified complexity, is empirically detectable. They're referring again to the message of the genetic code. And as I said in the previous video when we discussed that, DNA is not a message, it's a molecule. They are confusing an analogy used to help us explain and understand a thing for the thing itself. Next objection: intelligent design is religiously motivated. Geisler and Turek don't deny this charge. Quote, there are 2 aspects to this objection. The first is that some intelligent design people may be religiously motivated. So what? Does that make intelligent design false? No, the evidence does. The religious motivation explains why creationists, who are of the same ilk as intelligent design advocates, as Geisler and Turek themselves admitted earlier in this chapter, are willing to accept evidence or interpretations of evidence that they would have no reason to accept without the religious motivation. Continuing, quote, why are creationist conclusions immediately thought to be biased, but Darwinist conclusions automatically considered objective? Well, who says that Darwinist conclusions are automatically considered to be objective? Any scientific conclusion, in order to be accepted as valid, has to be demonstrated. If it's found that a given conclusion has been unduly influenced by personal bias, it will be rejected, or at the very least, viewed with a great deal of skepticism by other scientists. There was an article in The Onion in 1998 about an astronomer who had announced that the center of the universe was his 9-year-old son. That illustrates in a really exaggerated and funny way how this works, because in the article the astronomer cites all sorts of data to support his conclusion, but of course everything he says is hopelessly corrupted by his personal bias toward his son. That's the sort of thing that just doesn't fly in legitimate science. Despite using the terms creationism and intelligent design interchangeably in this chapter, Geisler and Turek now insist that intelligent design is not creation science. Quote, intelligent design scientists don't say that the data unambiguously supports the 6 24-hour day view of Genesis, or a worldwide flood. Instead, they acknowledge that the data for intelligent design is not based on a specific age or geologic history of the Earth. In short, regardless of what the Bible may say on the topic, Darwinism is rejected because it doesn't fit the scientific data, and intelligent design is accepted because it does. But see, that is precisely the problem with intelligent design. Because it doesn't make any specific claims about the age of the Earth or anything else, it's useless. It's a reaction to evolutionary theory, not a theory in its own right. It doesn't say, here's what happened, except in the most general sense. Instead, it looks at the theory of evolution and says, well, that can't be it. What about this? What about this and this and this and this? It's not unlike a conspiracy theory. It makes few positive claims of its own and is mostly intended to undermine an already established explanation. Also, in that quote that I just read, we catch another glimpse of Geisler and Turek's fundamental misunderstanding of how science works. They say that intelligent design is not based on a specific age or geologic history of the Earth, but we have solid, reliable data on which to base our estimate of the age of the Earth. If intelligent design would work just as well no matter what age we assume Earth to be, can it really be that reliable? If your theory will fit any data set, how valuable is your theory? Next section, so why are there still Darwinists? Why are there still Darwinists if the evidence for intelligent design is so strong? Well, the actual answer is that the evidence for intelligent design is non-existent, but again, let's play along. Geisler and Turek suggest 4 reasons why scientists like Richard Dawkins, who they again reference in this chapter, refuse to accept intelligent design. First, Darwinists are unwilling to admit that God, rather than they, is the ultimate authority on truth. I don't find this persuasive. Even if there were evidence for the existence of God, we would still need science to explain what's going on. As I've said before, God did it is not a sufficient explanation for anything. What did God do? When did he do it? How did he do it? How do we know he did it? These are all questions that we would still need to answer if we wanted to truly understand how the universe worked, even if God were demonstrated persuasively to exist. Also, we are the ultimate authority on truth, whether God exists or not. Not because we're above God, not because we necessarily have the power to determine what is true, but because we are all trapped within our perceptions. No matter what external evidence or authority that we are basing our conclusions on, ultimately it is we who believe or disbelieve. We who determine what we find plausible and what we don't. We all do it, theist and atheist and everyone else. We can't not do it. Second, admitting the existence of God would mean giving up the ability to account for events with natural explanations. And this is a really strange objection because this would seem to be a problem for theists as well, unless the theist in question just doesn't care whether reality is comprehensible. If you're willing to accept that God is directly responsible for some things, why can't God be directly responsible for everything? Why recognize the existence of natural laws or uniformity or logic at all? How can you tell the difference between a natural event and a miracle made to appear as a natural event? Third, Darwinists risk losing financial rewards and professional admiration. This is true only because intelligent design is such a fucking joke. If a scientist were able to find compelling evidence leading to a comprehensive, persuasive, working theory of intelligent design that actually accounted for things better than the theory of evolution, that scientist would be a legend in his or her own lifetime. Anyone who discovered evidence that overturned evolution, the unifying theory of biology, would be celebrated on the same level as Newton, Galileo, Einstein, Darwin, actually above Darwin if you would. There's absolutely nothing to prevent them from wanting to attain that goal if the evidence is there. There are huge financial and professional motivations. to rejecting Darwinism and embracing intelligent design if you can back it up. And so far, it ain't looking good. Fourth, Darwinists would be admitting that they don't have the authority to define right and wrong for themselves. Quote, by ruling out the supernatural, Darwinists can avoid the possibility that anything is morally prohibited. What does moral theory have to do with whether or not you accept biological evidence? I suppose every scientist who accepts evolution does so because he or she is willfully rejecting God's moral authority. Rejecting the supernatural doesn't require rejecting the concept of an external moral authority. I don't subscribe to the supernatural, I reject it, and I believe that morality is 100% man-made. But that doesn't mean I make my own rules. I appeal to moral standards that exist outside of myself. I don't think they come from God, I think they come from other people, from a moral consensus of which I am a small part and in which I am a constant participant along with everyone else. But I don't just arbitrarily decide what is right and what is wrong for myself. That sounds a lot more like something that Geisler and Turek's asshole God would do. Quote, this is not to say that all Darwinists have such motivations for their beliefs. Some may truly believe that the scientific evidence supports their theory. We think they get this misconception because most Darwinists rarely study the research of those in other fields. I might say something similar about creationists, only I would say that creationists rarely understand the research of those in legitimate scientific fields. Next section, how important is the age of the universe? Not very important, apparently, since intelligent design doesn't bother to consider a specific age for Earth. Geisler and Turek say that the age of the universe isn't that important to their argument. What really matters is their larger claim. Quote, we can debate how long the days in Genesis were, or whether the assumptions that are made in dating techniques are valid, but when we do, we must be sure not to obscure the larger point that this creation requires a creator. Yes, as long as you believe God made everything. Details like what God did, how God did it, how long ago God did it, and how we know God did it don't matter because science. And Geisler and Turek conclude the chapter with a proposal that intelligent design, as they have been presenting it in the previous few chapters of this book, be taught to public school students alongside evolution. Quote, why don't we give our children all the scientific evidence, pro and con, and let them make up their own minds? After all, shouldn't we be teaching them how to think critically on their own? Of course we should. But Darwinists will go to great lengths to ensure that that doesn't happen. Darwinists would rather suppress the evidence than allow it to be presented fairly. Why? Because this is the one area where Darwinists lack faith. They lack the faith to believe that their theory will still be believed after our children see all the evidence. I question whether they really would want children to be taught critical thinking. So they want to gain acceptance for intelligent design, not by presenting their theories to trained professional scientists and persuading them, but by teaching it to children who lack the skills and the knowledge to evaluate it as though it were true. Indoctrinating children who don't know any better to accept baseless claims as the truth. If you needed any more evidence that intelligent design is fundamentally rooted in religion, there you go. That's it for this chapter. I will be back in the next video to review Chapter 7, the charmingly titled Mother Teresa versus Hitler. They will be dealing with the moral argument. That should be interesting. It has a lot to live up to with that title, though, doesn't it? So that's it for this chapter. I'll be back in the next chapter in the next video in the series. Thank you, as always, for watching. Your comments, your questions, your additions, your arguments, what have you, are always welcome. I look forward to reading your comments and having a conversation with you about this. Thanks for being interested in this and continuing to watch it and share it and everything else. And I will see you in the next video.